Hey, how's everyone doing? Welcome back. This is the fourth and final episode in the Scientific Calculator series. By the end of this video, we should have our app completed, so let's get started. Alright, so in this video, we don't have anything really complex to do, but if you remember in the previous video when we rotated the user's device, we got all this weird funky stuff happening. The buttons were too big, they were going off screen, and we didn't have all the extra buttons that we saw in the demo at the start of this series. So that's what we're going to be doing in this video, is creating that extra layout file so that the user has access to those other buttons and it doesn't get all messed up when they rotate their screen. So how do we create this extra layout? Well, it's pretty simple. All you have to do is come over to your activity main.xml, click that design button in the far right corner, and then come over to your toolbar for your XML file, and you're looking for this button right here. It looks like the user is actually like rotating it. So if you click this button, a drop-down menu should appear, and all you have to do is click the Create Landscape Variation, and it should create a landscape layout for you. Now, if you remember, in the last video, this is what we saw when we rotated the user's device. It was all messed up and wacky, so what we have to do now is modify all the views that were previously on our activity main.xml for the portrait view and modify them so they can fit on the landscape view. Now, before we go ahead and actually start making some modifications to our new landscape layout, what I'd like to do is show you guys what actually happened when we created this new file. So if you come over to the far left, come down to your resources folder, expand that, and then we're going to come down to layout. If we expand this folder, you can see we have a new folder in there called activity main. These are all the files associated with our main activity. So if we expand this folder, you'll see we have two files in here that are named exactly the same thing, except for the bottom folder, it should have the word land in parentheses around it. So what Android Studio can now do with these two files is pick which one to run given the orientation of the user's device. So in the case that the user has their phone in the portrait mode, it's going to run this first file here, the activity main.xml, not the landscape version, the portrait version. But if the user decides to rotate their device into the landscape view, Android Studio is going to come into the activity main file and then determine that it needs to run the landscape file rather than the portrait file. So if that doesn't make sense, leave a comment down below and I could explain it a little bit differently for you. But now that we have a better understanding of what Android Studio is doing with this extra file, let's go ahead into our landscape activity main.xml. Let's start modifying some of these buttons so they fit on the user's screen. All right, so this is the easy part. Let's come over to the far right, click the split button so we can see our XML associated with our landscape XML file. And what I want to do is modify the width and height of each of our buttons that we currently have displayed. So I'm going to change the width to a value of 0 dp and the height to a value of 40 dp. So if we come over to the far right, we could take a look at the effect that this has, and you can see the clear button was modified and it's been shrunk a little bit and elongated. So I'm going to go ahead, modify all the buttons that we have currently on here, and then I'll be back. Alright, so now that I got the width and height of each of our buttons modified, so let's go ahead, take a look at the effect that that had. So I'm going to click the design button in the far right, and you can see all of our buttons are the same width and height. They all have a width of 0 dp and a height of 40 dp. With the exception of our 0 button, we're going to change that in just a second. But what I'd like to do is shift the buttons from our delete button all the way down to our plus button, down 1, and shift the equals and decimal button over 1 to the left. So what we need to do is modify the constraints of this outermost row so we can get a 4x5 rectangle. So to start off, let's shift over the equals and decimal button. To do this, we're going to have to remove a few of the constraints on our 0 button, because if you remember, it has a constraint from the leftmost portion of the 1 button and the rightmost portion of our 2 button. So it expands the entire width of those 2 buttons above it. So let's go ahead, remove the right constraint of our 0 button by coming over to the far right in your attributes panel, and you're looking for this section of the attributes panel here. It's the layout section, and all you have to do is find this little square here and click this circle that says delete right constraint. So if we delete that, it should span the entire width of the 1 button, and the equals and decimal button should have shifted over along with it. But there is one thing we need to change with each of these buttons, and that's the top constraint. You'll notice that the decimal button is constrained to the bottom of the 3 button. Now this isn't really an issue, but it does kind of bother me, so I'm going to remove the topmost constraint for our decimal button, and I'm going to give it a constraint to the bottom of the button above it, which happens to be the 2 button. But once we add in that constraint, you'll notice that the decimal button is flush with the 2 button. That's because the margin was removed To add that back in, all you have to do is come back over to your attributes panel in the layout section and then type in a 10 in this little slot here, hit enter, and a margin of 10 dp should have been applied. So I'm going to do the same thing for the equals button, remove the top constraint, and then give it a constraint to the bottom of button 3, and then add in a 10 dp margin. So now that we have all that done, we just need to shift this row down 1. To do this, all we have to do is remove a few constraints. Let's start off by removing the leftmost constraint of our delete button and the leftmost constraint of all the arithmetic buttons. So now that we have the rightmost constraint removed, I'm going to remove the topmost constraint of each of our arithmetic buttons. And just to reiterate how to do this, all you have to do is click this little button here on the perimeter of that square. An X should appear on that button, and it should say delete top constraint. Click it, and that constraint should be removed. So I'm going to do the same thing for the 3 buttons below it. And then all we have to do is drag and drop these to their correct position. Okay, so now that we have our arithmetic button, the equals button, and decimal button in their correct spots, all we have to do is get our delete button in that little corner right there. But to do that, we're going to have to change quite a few things. So if you remember, our clear button, open and closing parentheses, are constrained to the bottom of our delete button. We need to remove their top constraints. So I'm going to go ahead, click that little bubble again to remove the top constraints. And then we need to add a constraint from the top of our clear button and the parentheses button to the top of our constraint layout. Now that we have that, all we need to do is add a top constraint of our divide button to the bottom of our delete button, the top constraint of our multiplication button to the bottom of our divide button, minus to multiply, plus to minus, and then let's go ahead, add a 10 dp margin to the top of all of our arithmetic buttons. And then the final thing we have to do is add a left constraint to the right of our closing parentheses button and add a 10 dp margin to the left of it. And then all of our buttons should be uniform throughout our constraint layout. All right, so now that we have our original buttons all set up, what I'd like to do now is add in the 15 additional buttons. Now there's 2 ways we can do this. I'm going to go with the second way. It's going to be a lot easier, but the first way is probably the better way to do it. So the first way is adding in the additional 15 buttons to our current constraint layout. The second way is adding in a new constraint layout, putting in those 15 additional buttons into the newer constraint layout, and going from there. Now, generally, from what I've read, the less layouts you have on your activity, the better. So if you want to mess around with all the buttons, you can place the 15 additional ones in our current constraint layout, but it's going to be a mess. So to make things really simple for everyone, I'm just going to add in another constraint layout. So to start off, let's click our current constraint layout and let's change the constraints just a little bit. So if we come over to our attributes panel in the layout section, all we have to do is take this little slider here and slide it all the way over to the right and make this bottom constraint a value of 10 dp. And then what I'm going to do is remove the leftmost constraint because we're going to have that being constraint to the new constraint layout. So now that we have all that set up, let's come over to the right in our palette section and let's add in our new constraint layout. So scroll down until you see the layout button, click it, and then all we have to do is drag in a new constraint layout onto our landscape activity main.xml. So with our new constraint layout, we're going to add in those 15 additional buttons. To add in those buttons, we need to go back over to the palette section, click the button tab, and then drag in a new button to our constraint layout. Now, instead of just adding in 15 buttons, what I'd like to do is add in constraints as we place in our new buttons. So our first button is going to have a constraint to the far left of our constraint layout. So click that little bubble, drag it over to the far left, and that far left bubble should turn a solid blue. I'm going to do the same thing for the top constraint, and then I'm going to drag in a new button. Essentially, all we're doing is the exact same thing that we did for this little section of buttons over here. So again, I'm going to add a constraint to the leftmost portion of this button, and then I'm going to add in a top constraint here. I'm going to drag in another button because we're going to make a 3x5 rectangle. So drag this one just next to the last button, add a left constraint and a top constraint. And then I'm going to continue this pattern, except we're going to go below this row. I'm going to add a top constraint to the bottom of that first button, and then add a constraint to the far left. And I'm going to continue this pattern up until we have 15 buttons. So I'm going to speed this part up because it's going to take a while. But once I get this done, I'll be back. Okay, we got our 15 buttons placed in here. Now what we have to do is modify our constraint layout just a little bit. So let's come back over to our attributes panel and let's change our layout width and height from match parent to wrap content. So all you have to do is click the drop down, click wrap content, and click wrap content. And then it should wrap all the buttons within it. And then we're going to add a bottom constraint to the bottom of our activity. We're going to add a left constraint to the leftmost portion of our activity. And then we're going to give it a right constraint to the constraint layout right next to it. So it should look something like this. What I'm going to do is come over to the attributes panel again, and I'm going to give it a 10 dp margin from the bottom so they're level with one another. And then what we have to do is modify the new buttons so they match the same width and height of these buttons here. So let's come over to the far right, click the split view so we can see the XML. All we have to do is find the new constraint layout. And then what I want to do is add a width of 0 dp and a height of 40 dp. I'm going to copy this line of code and add that to the rest of the buttons, and then I'll be back. Okay, so now that we have the correct size for these buttons, let's go ahead and add in the correct background for them as well. So I'm going to go up to one of the older buttons, and I'm just going to copy the background attribute, and then I'm just going to go ahead and paste that into the rest of the buttons. And if we come over, take a look at the preview, you can see this first button right here changed to the correct background. All I'm doing is pasting that attribute in for the rest of our buttons, and then I'll be back. All right, so now that we have the correct background for our new buttons, let's go ahead and set up the text for them as well. So what we need to do is come over to the far left, expand the resources folder, come all the way down to the values folder, expand that as well. And then we're going to double click on the strings.xml file, and we should see all the strings that we have defined for our current project. What we need to do is add in a few more strings for the 15 additional buttons. So I already have a bunch of strings defined. By the time that I have this video uploaded, this should be on my GitHub page, so you can go ahead and just copy all these strings. I tried placing them in a YouTube comment not too long ago, and for whatever reason, I can't place in angle brackets in the YouTube comments. I'm not sure why. I'm sure there's a reason for it, but I can't. So I would paste them in the comment section, but you're gonna have to go over to GitHub to obtain these strings there. But I would like to explain a few things about the inverse trig functions and the exponent functions as well. I used a superscript tag and a small tag. What this is doing is reducing the size of the -1 and raising it up into the exponent spot. And then I'm doing the same exact thing for our x squared and x to the y. So all we have to do now is come back over to the activity main.xml, but the landscape version, and apply each of those buttons to their corresponding button. So I'm going to scroll up to the top to find our constraint layout, and then here's our first button. And this first button should be the sign button. So what did I name that? I just called it trig sign text. So I'm going to replace this with an @string / trig sign text. And then let's define a text color as well so we can see that. So text color, and I think we use the tan accent. And if we take a look at our design, you can see we have the sign button here, and you'll notice that it's in all caps. We could fix that really quick by coming back over to the XML and adding in another attribute called Android text all caps and setting that equal to false. And then if we come back over to our design, you can see sign is all lowercase. So I'm going to come back over to the XML. I'm going to copy these two lines here. Then I'm going to go through, change the text of each of their buttons, and then I'll be back. All right, so I have all the correct text on each of our new buttons. Let's go ahead, take a look at the design, and you can see we have these new functions defined for our calculator. The next thing that I'd like to do is make the text just a little bit bigger so the user can read it a little bit better. So I'm going to give each of these buttons a text size of 15 SP, so Android text size 15 SP. I'm going to copy this line and paste it into the rest of our buttons. And now that we changed the text size of each of our new buttons, what we need to do now is add in 10 dp margin for each of our buttons. So I'm going to come up to the older buttons, and I'm going to find the margin start and margin top. I'm going to copy these two lines here, and I'm going to go through the newer buttons and just paste those in. But remember, we're not adding in a margin start for this column here, and we're not adding in a margin top for this row of buttons here. So I'm going to go through, add in our 10 dp margin for the newer buttons, and then I'll be back. All right, guys, so I got all the margins set up for our new buttons. We're getting really close to being done. All we need to do now is set up the on-click listeners for our new buttons, change the edit text size just a little bit, and change the text view that should be somewhere around here. It should be above our edit text, but we need to bring that down and the edit text down as well, so the user can actually see it when we rotate our screen. But before we go ahead and modify any of the edit text and text view sizes, let's set up those on-click listeners by coming over to the mainActivity.java file and scrolling all the way down just past our backspace button on-click listener, and we're going to set up 15 more. So again, we set these up by typing in public void, and then you name your on-click listener. So for our sign trig function, what I'm going to call it is trig sign btn push. And then remember, we got to take in a view. So view, we're going to call it view. And then this will be our on-click listener for our sign button. And then I'm going to copy this guy and go through and create 14 more on-click listeners for the newer buttons right over here. And then I'll be back. All right, so I have the 15 new on-click listeners set up, and what we have to do now is actually assign those on-click listeners to their corresponding button. So to do that, all we have to do is click the button that we want to assign an on-click listener to. To start off, let's just assign one to the sign button. I'm going to click it, come over to the attributes panel, scroll down just a little bit until we come into our common attributes. And then we're looking for this on-click slot right here. Click the drop down, and all you're doing is looking for whatever you name the on-click listener for your sign button. So in my case, I called it trig sign button push. So once you scroll through the list and you actually find it, so mine's right here, trig sign button push. All you have to do is click it, and now that on-click listener will be executed anytime that sign button is pressed. And just in case you don't see any of your on-click listeners in your on-click drop down, be sure to check that you actually set those on-click listeners as public and they're not set as private, because if they're set as private, you won't see them in that drop down. So I'm going to go ahead, assign the rest of the on-click listeners to our 14 buttons, and then I'll be back. Okay, so now that I have all the on-click listeners set up, what we got to do now is come back over to the mainActivity.java file and make it so our on-click listeners actually do something. If you remember in the previous videos, to add in that functionality to our on-click listeners, so updating our display with the correct text, we wrote this update text function. So we're going to be using the same exact thing. We don't need to write anything new. So I'm just going to type in update text, and then we need to update this text with the specific function that mXparser is looking for when it's analyzing our expression. So in the case of the sign function, it's looking for sign. That's all it's looking for, with an open and closing parentheses. But I'm just going to place in this opening parentheses so the user can type in whatever they need to, and then they just have to end it with a closing parentheses. So for the sign function, I'm going to type in sign, open parentheses. And then just in case you're wondering where I'm getting these from, if you come over to the mXparser library, come over to this mXparser collection, and then all you have to do is find the functions that you'd like to use. So in this case, we have sign, and then an example is sign of x. So all we have to do is type in sign into our edit text, and we should be able to use this function. So the same thing for like arcsign, we could put in a sign or we could put in arcsign, and it'll work the same exact way. So all you have to do is find the function that you'd like to use in this list here. There's quite a few functions you could use. You can look through them all if you want, but you just got to find the keyword and make sure that the edit text is being updated with that keyword. I'll put this link in the description below, so be sure to check that out if you want to change a few of the functions that are being used in this tutorial. So I'm going to go ahead and add in this update text function to the rest of our on-click listeners and change them to their appropriate function. So in this case, cosine is COS with an opening parentheses. So I'm gonna get this done and then I'll be back. All right, so I went ahead and added in the update text method for each of the on-click listeners, and I'd like to show you guys what I'm updating the edit text with for a few of these on-click listeners. So for the prime button push, I'm typing in ISPR with an opening parentheses. For the X power Y button, all I'm doing is a little caret with an opening parentheses, and the X squared button gets a little caret, and then in parentheses we have a 2. So if you wanted like an X cubed, you could change this 2 to a 3, or a 4, 5, and so on. But for the X squared, I'm just going to keep it as a 2. For the E and pi button, all I have is PI for pi, and we have E for E. that little constant. For the absolute value, we have ABS, SQRT for square root, and the rest of them are pretty self-explanatory, like log is just log, natural log, ln. So here's everything. Again, this will just be on GitHub, so if you just want to copy this, go to my GitHub page. By the time this is uploaded, it should all be there. Okay, so now that we use the update text method in the 15 new on-click listeners, what I'd like to do is modify our landscape XML file just a little bit. So let's change up our edit text so it fits on the screen a little bit better. So I'm going to go over to the far right, click the split view, and then I'm going to find the edit text tag in our XML file. And I'm going to start off by changing the margin bottom from 40 dp to 10 dp. We're going to change the padding start and end from 10 dp to 20 dp. And then I'm going to change the text size from 48 sp to 36 sp. And then what we need to do is find the text view and add in a margin to it. So I'm going to type in Android : layout margin end. I'm going to give that a value of 10 dp. And then one last thing we could do is probably move over our old constraint layout just a little bit. So if we come over to the attributes panel, I'm going to give a right margin of 15 dp, so it's kind of centered a little bit better. All right, so now that we have that all set up, I did notice one thing. I didn't add a left constraint to this column of buttons here. I'm going to add that in really quick. And now the error in the component tree should be gone. And now let's finally run this app and see where we're at. All right, so the app loaded up. Let's check to make sure that we can actually do some basic operations with this. So if we do 3 times 3, we should get 9, which we do. We could do something like 8 minus 9, and we should get like a -1. Perfect, times that by 9. Okay, everything looks like it's working. Now if we rotate the screen, we do in fact get those 15 additional buttons. So let's test out these extra buttons. So if we did like 5 squared, we should get 25, which we do, pretty sweet. We could do our sine functions, like sine of 5. We get this number here. We could try out arc sine, but remember this is gonna have to be like a decimal value. So we get 0.2526. And we could check our prime number function. So it's like 8, a prime number, shouldn't be, so we get 0. Prime number of 11 should be, and we get a 1. So everything looks like it's working, but I did forget to do one thing. The previous equation. I don't think I ever added that in anywhere. So if we rotate our screen back to the portrait mode, if we do something like 8 times 8, we get 64, but the 8 times 8 never appears here. This part should take like 3 seconds. So let's come back over to the main activity.java file. All we're doing is looking for the equal button push. And if you remember in a previous video, we already set up our previous calculation. We've already linked that text view that's going to show the previous equation to this Java variable here. So all we have to do is set the text from whatever we extract from the user's expression and set it to our text view. So we can type in previous calculation dot set text, and we're just going to set that to whatever user expression we happen to extract out of our edit text. So save that, run it, and now if we do our 8 times 8, we should get 64 as our answer, and the 8 times 8 pops up in the top right-hand corner of our app. But don't forget, if we click the clear button, we also need to clear the text in our text view. I just forgot to do that, so let's go back. In our clear button text, what we need to do is type in previous calculation dot set text, and we're just going to set it to an empty string. So now if we run this, we should get an empty string anytime we clear our display. So if we do something like 9 times 9, we get 9 times 9 here, clear it, and now everything is back to normal. So it looks like this is it for the Scientific Calculator series. If you guys did make it this far, I'd like to personally thank you for watching this all the way through. These videos take a ton of time to make. I think the last one took me like, I don't know, 8 or 9 hours to put together. So if you guys do find these videos helpful, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.